Meanwhile, you have this QAnon lady. I'm going off on a tangent today. But anyone see the QAnon lady's tweet?
Marjorie about the mask?
I don't even know her name, but she was like, I'm sure she's going to listen to this podcast and say, I have a name. Excuse me.
Hello, I'm Guido Girgenti, and you're listening to Bloc Party, a show about the growing bloc of progressives inside Congress and the movements transforming the party's agenda from outside the halls of power. Our first ever episode this week is what we at the Bloc Party call a group chat. The world is pretty bad right now, but the vibes are still good in the group chat. This week, it's a no new friends kind of vibe, a home team huddle, me and my colleagues at Justice Democrats discussing the fight in the Democratic Party that's broken out since the election. In the chat today, my co-host, the spokesperson for Justice Democrats, and a very senior Democratic strategist, Waleed Shahid. How are you today?
I'm doing great. I'm ready to get started. First episode of the Bloc Party. Let's fucking go.
Wow.
Am I allowed to curse?
Yeah, I think so. Also joining us, a group chat regular, Amira Hassan. She worked on Capitol Hill for Senator Amy Klobuchar, Senate Minority Leader Chuck Schumer, and now as the political director for Justice Democrats. A very unique resume. Amira, how are you doing?
I'm ready. Let's go.
All right, since Election Day, a fight has broken out in the Democratic Party. I want to recap the debate thus far and then get your takes. So, the House and Senate Democrats underperformed their polling on election night. House Democrats lost, at the time of this recording, I think at least 8 incumbents have lost their seats. It's a disappointing result that revived a factional fight in the Democratic Party, and it spilled into the open in a way that it hasn't in the past. The reason it spilled into the open is because Abigail Spanberger, a congresswoman who flipped Virginia's 7th district from red to blue in 2018, spoke very frankly about her thoughts on Democrats' underperformance on a caucus call, and the audio was leaked to the Washington Post.
We need to not ever use the word socialist or socialism ever again. Because while people think it doesn't matter, it does matter. And we lost good members because of that.
Now, much of the ensuing debate sparked by Congresswoman Spanberger was about ideology. Do progressive ideas help or hurt Democrats? And a lot of evidence was thrown at this debate. AOC pointed out that every member who ran on Medicare for All won re-election. I think the left can also point to progressive ballot initiatives that outperformed Democratic candidates, including Joe Biden, like a Florida ballot initiative to raise the minimum wage that won 60% of the vote in Florida. That's the same Florida that voted for Trump. Data for Progress, a progressive think tank, also added some data to this debate over ideology, comparing the performance of Democrats in swing and Republican-leaning districts with their ideology scores. They found that there's simply no evidence that progressive Democrats did worse than their more moderate counterparts in swing and Republican districts. I thought one of the more interesting findings were that swing seat Democrats who underperformed their 2018 result, did worse this year than in 2018, were on average more conservative than swing district Democrats who overperformed their 2018 result. Those Democrats who overperformed were on average a bit more progressive. So progressive ideology is either helping swing district Democrats improve their performance, or at a minimum, it's clearly not hurting. But the debate has still been raging, and I think Democrats like Spanberger essentially reply and say, look, this or that progressive may have done well in their district with those policies, but in my district, attack ads about socialism hurt me. And I think that argument gets us into the second part of the debate, where we start to ask, is it really progressive ideas and attack ads that are costing people their seats? Or is it candidates just not running a good campaign for their district? AOC started looking for answers to that question and was not impressed with what she found, as she told the New York Times.
I started to say, okay, well, let me see if they actually did their job, right? And what I found was just criminal. It was just malpractice. Connor Lamb spent $2,000 on Facebook the week before the election. If you're not door knocking, if you're not on the internet, if your main points of reliance are TV and mail, then you're not running a campaign on all cylinders.
But it wasn't just AOC and the left making a tactical criticism. Beto O'Rourke sent an email to his list after the election when Democrats failed to flip Texas blue, and he said the central messaging that Democratic candidates felt obligated to adopt because they believe that funding and support from Democratic organization was contingent on it doesn't work. He also added that we have to be far better on digital and social media. So have progressive candidates and candidates like Beto O'Rourke learned something about running a campaign on all cylinders that moderates don't know? What do you make of how this debate has been playing out?
This answer is going to be super unsatisfying for anybody who wants it to be one thing. It's not going to be one thing, right? It is going to be a complex answer that has a lot of like different threads that you got to run down. But when you are the underdog, right, and progressives usually are, you have to out-hustle and outwork incumbents and candidates who have the backing of institutional power and resources. That also leaves you much more open to like new ideas and not fall into risk-averse politics in both structural terms and ideas. So pulling from my own experience here working in the Senate, I can tell you new ideas and innovation are not super welcomed with open arms, right? Things are stale because there are a lot of gatekeepers who want things to stay stale. But I know the conversation has focused on campaigns a lot, but I also, will say that this is also a conversation about governance. What you do when you are on the inside, right? Incumbents who do not show up to their districts, who do not return emails, letters, and calls from their, to their constituents, and who don't hold town halls, don't keep their seats. It's not just what you do during the on cycle, right? It matters a whole effing lot how you show up for your constituents. You can't go begging for a vote when they haven't seen you the entire year prior to that. Defining yourself isn't about skirting tough conversations as a politician. It's about building deep trust with your voters. So like the National Democratic Party has just flat out failed in building out local state infrastructures. Like I said earlier, and if we want to see the tide turn in states like Georgia and Arizona and keep them blue, the party has to wake up and invest in building infrastructure. And as far as messaging goes, messaging should be calibrated to be heard by your voters and constituents. I personally have no patience for politicians who complain about being labeled by Republican attack ads and that being an impossible hurdle to overcome. Are you kidding me? I'm not going to shed a tear for you when you don't know how to break through some blatant lies without tacking to the right. You won't be rewarded or win back voters that way. You can and should calibrate a message of economic and racial justice so that it can be heard and understood by the people you represent. But that is not what is being advocated by the likes of Miss Stay Mad Abigail Spanberger. Like, she could stay mad, Abby. That is the crux of it. If you are going to you should calibrate your message. You should know how somebody's going to receive it. You might not talk about economic and racial justice in the terms that I would talk about it, talking to my friends who are all on the same page, right? You calibrate to reach the people where they're at and push them beyond that, right? But first you have to build trust. And that is something you can't do by just showing up last minute. And that isn't going to change if you try to pivot to the right. That doesn't do anything. Waleed, what's your take?
Well, my main take was I think Congresswoman Spanberger is upset because it was a closer race than she thought it was. I think a lot of the conservative Democrats who either had close races or lost their seats are upset and they want to point fingers. But at the end of the day, Democrats have been attacked as socialists since 1932. I went in and looked at the ads that Republicans were running against all of these swing seat Democrats, and they are traditional Republican Party ads. Most of the ads run against these members are about how Democrats want to raise your taxes, about how Democrats are soft on crime, and how Democrats are a party controlled by San Francisco liberal Nancy Pelosi. There's way more mentions of Nancy Pelosi in these ads than Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez or Ilhan Omar. And I just think that there is something that, I think Amira is right where she says anyone who's looking for one answer to this question is going to be unsatisfied, is going to be dissatisfied. But I just am frustrated with the blame the left because it's easy to do. One other thing about Spanberger is there was 4 ads run against her by the NRCC. 3 of the 4 ads talk about how she is a puppet of the Saudi Arabia government because she worked in a school sponsored by the Saudi Arabia government. And I'm like, why aren't we talking about that? The ad is crazy and racist. And that is the ad they ran the most against her. And it's, she wants to there's one ad that talks about her being a puppet of the left, but the other 3 are this crazy conspiracy theory that she's some Saudi puppet. And I'm just I think there's this asymmetric conflict going on where Republicans will say Abigail Spanberger is a puppet of the Saudi Arabia government. And then Spanberger will say back, I'm ready to work across the aisle and find common ground. And I'm like, how is that? Are we playing the same game here? What? I will be the first person to say that just because you're right on all of the issues doesn't mean you're going to win. There are plenty of good progressive candidates who are right on the issues, but didn't run good campaigns. And so you have to be able, Jamal Bowman in his race was attacked for being a tax delinquent and not voting for President Obama and for supporting positions he didn't support, and he still won his race. Cori Bush was attacked for being anti-Israel, and people insinuated she was anti-Semitic and that she was a communist and all this stuff. And, Cori Bush was able to beat back those ads. And, every campaign is different, but you have to be able to take on their message. And that means sometimes going on offense and not just playing defense. So, finding common ground and reaching across the aisle doesn't explain to a voter how you're going to improve their lives. It's just a tactical thing that, people in Washington might understand, but no one knows how that's going to put food on their table or help them with their health care. And then the last thing I was going to say is that, Amira brought up this point about how the Democratic Party is not investing, beyond election cycle from election cycle. And that's true. And the reason I know it is because my organization has defeated the Democratic machinery time and time again. And the Democratic Party machine that used to turn out voters for general elections just doesn't exist anymore. If the Democratic Party machinery gets better, it will probably make primaries more difficult. But at the same time, you can't just rely on, organization racial justice organizations in Philadelphia and Atlanta to do your whole turnout machine. And if you are going to rely on them, you should probably give them more funding than you're helping give the Lincoln Project. Those are my 3 takes. These attacks aren't new. You got to be able to fight the attacks. And there is no Democratic Party. It's a bunch of organizations that are doing turnout ad hoc, and the ones that are doing it the best aren't invested in.
Yes. And can we also take a moment to discuss Rep Slotkin's political magazine interview this morning? I pulled this quote because it really pissed me off. And I think it's an endemic thing that moderates say all the time, which is a blatant falsehood. But okay, so this is the quote. She's like, well, there's a place for people who push the envelope. American history is moved forward by people on all sides of the political spectrum who push the envelope. So I don't fault them for doing that. That's what their constituents expected. But please don't fault me for doing what my constituents expect of me. I'm like, cool. If she had ended it there, totally reasonable thing to say. But this is the part. This is the part that's like, girl, what? Which is governing and getting something done. Because, what are you talking about, girl? All of y'all collectively got the same amount of stuff done, to be honest. Everything went to go die in McConnell's legislative graveyard. What governance? What did you do, right? And by the way, moderates are spoon-fed every legislative win so they can go back to their districts and talk about their legislative wins, right? This is going behind the scenes. This is how things happen on the Hill. Leadership and committee chairs, right, are all told, and what they do is quote unquote protect their frontliners. So they bend over backwards to protect them. And so you don't really have to hustle or work to get something passed. Bills are actually handed to you, and they're like, here, Abigail Spanberger, this is your bill. So you could go home and say you got something done, right? Like, you are not like better at governance or have any idea what you're doing or getting something done. So it just always like positioning progressives as not serious and not getting stuff done, when collectively as the Democratic Party, nobody has gotten anything done. Let's be honest about that.
Okay, now Amira's got me going. I got to respond to this.
Okay, go.
Okay, what Slotkin is describing there is so frustrating because I don't want to point her out individually, but like that brand of conservative Democrat, moderate Democrat, their entire shtick is to say that, you know, the left is going too far and Donald Trump is going too far, and I'm just here to get things done. And it doesn't mean anything. They don't have real concrete beliefs or policies of what they want to accomplish to improve people's lives. What they do is politics, which is say the Green New Deal, Medicare for all is too far, and I just want to act on healthcare and climate. And it's like that policy that they support is set by Washington insiders and Nancy Pelosi and Chuck Schumer and Joe Biden. It's not like folks are coming up with their own policies on themselves, but it's the reason why so much of this is like so stupid, because in 2009, these frontline Democrats were the ones who were against the Waxman-Markey bill for cap and trade, and they were against the public option, and then they were against a $15 minimum wage, and they were against action for dreamers because it was all going too far. And then what they were for were these compromises that never really solved anyone's problems, but the whole media says they're the smart ones getting things done. And now today, they agree with all of the progressive positions from 2009. And so I'm like, I'm tired of it. I'm just like, what? This doesn't make sense. This isn't smart. And people pretend that it's smart politics when it's just, you know, I get the first part of what she's saying, where she's like, you know, it's okay to say that like some people are going to take some positions, some people are going to take other positions, but acting like one of those things is getting something done and the other thing is not, is completely backwards and doesn't actually like show how like empty some parts of the Democratic Party are, where their main purpose in life, their main governing philosophy is to be the center point between progressives and moderate Republicans. And I don't think that's a plan. I don't think that's an ideology. I think that's just them doing politics, and it's okay if they want to do it, but let's just say what it is.
Okay, talking about the cap and trade bill, remember when Joe Manchin took a shotgun to the cap and trade bill and shot it because he was against it, doing gimmicky shit like that, and was talking in that video, he was talking about how he's like struck down the bad parts about the ACA, and then fast forward 2018, he's like a resistance hero, like loving the ACA and shooting up the Trump care bill. And also on I have to mention Joe Manchin and his daughter, who is the CEO of Mylan Pharmaceutical, right? That is best known for jacking up EpiPens by 500% in 2016, right? Like it went from $100 in 2009 to costing $600.
He has to protect the EpiPens because that's what moderate voters in West Virginia want.
And it's like, oh, you don't want to talk about Medicare for all. Okay, let's talk about drug pricing. Oh, wait, your daughter is the CEO of a pharmaceutical company that is jacking up the prices. Totally seems reasonable that, like, get the fuck out of here. The whole thing.
Speaking of Joe Manchin, this is something I wanted to ask you two about. This morning, Joe Manchin said, quote, "defund my butt," as a way of dismissing the demand to defund the police. Then Sunrise started running a petition to actually defund Joe Manchin's butt. But that aside, defund the police has been a big part of this factional fight. Senior Democrats and frontline Democrats blame that demand for costing them seats. Representative Jim Clyburn has been saying on cable news, quote, "defund the police is killing our party." In response to Democrats like Clyburn, Congresswoman Rashida Tlaib didn't back down, telling Politico, quote, "we're not interested in a unity that asks people to sacrifice their freedom or their rights any longer." There's something here that reminds me of a point Waleed made earlier, which is that establishment Democrats will frame themselves as the serious ones, right? Like, come on, guys, defund the police. That's not popular in my district. Cut that shit out. But I think that attitude, that analysis, and the way that they're blaming the squad is actually quite unserious for a few reasons, but I'll just focus on one. So I could do the same thing, right? I could say, hey, let's get serious, everyone. We want to defeat Trump. We got Democrats with a range of ideologies in districts across the country. So each member has to take responsibility for boosting the party's turnout while also doing your best to represent your constituents. Okay, sounds reasonable, sounds serious. So if you're Ilhan Omar in Minneapolis or Rashida Tlaib in Detroit, getting that job done means you gotta be responsive to your constituents. You're gonna build out a robust campaign operation because you're trying to get big turnout in those blue cities where Democrats need to run up the numbers. And that's what they did. They both built extensive canvassing programs to maximize Democratic turnout in those cities that Democrats needed big turnout in. Now, turnout was up across the country. So if you want to see more clear evidence of the fruits of their labor, for example, you can look at Representative Ilhan Omar's primary in her district on August 5th when there was no national election. Between 2018 and 2020, Ilhan Omar increased the number of votes she won by 35,000. She increased turnout by 40,000 votes overall. And she did all this against a challenger who was spending $4 million to unseat her. And that was just the organizing work that she did up until August. And then she continued door knocking until the end of the election. And she's rightfully gotten credit for this work. Minnesota Senator Tina Smith said to the Washington Post, the 5th district, Ilhan Omar's district, is really an engineer for statewide majorities. But it wouldn't be if Ilhan showed up 6 weeks before the election and said, hey, here I am, vote for me. Okay, doing great so far. So what is Ilhan doing months before Election Day to get the job done? Well, we've talked about she's knocking doors, she's building a robust campaign operation, and she is responding to the historic mobilization for racial justice happening in her district and across the country. And she has said this. When she's asked whether the activism in the streets is going to translate into votes, Representative Omar has said, people who were taking to the streets could clearly see how we, politicians, were able to translate their cries into legislation. The Democratic caucus in Congress passed a police reform bill within 30 days. Okay, so that's Representative Omar doing her job well. She's representing her constituents, and she's boosting turnout to defeat Trump in Minnesota. If you're in a swing district and your constituents are different, then you're going to have a different plan. But I don't understand blaming your progressive colleagues in Detroit and in Minneapolis for an attack ad that's being aired in Virginia because those representatives were doing their job, responding to their constituents, and running up the numbers in blue cities. Like, be serious. It's a big coalition. People are representing different districts, and we know the GOP is going to attack you. They're attacking you right now as a puppet of Saudi Arabia. And then, okay, they're going to throw in defund the police. That's politics. It's not serious to demand that all Democrats help the party by working to defeat Trump. And then when people do that successfully by being responsive to their constituents, you turn around and say, oh, well, actually, that was bad because the GOP ran an attack ad against me. So what do you make of the way Defund the Police has been used by senior Democrats to blame the left? And do you think the politics of the issue are changing now that there's this growing block of progressives who won't back down on issues of racial justice?
Are you ready?
We are ready.
I think that the discussion around defund the police, I want to be really clear, is not a question about messaging and polling, right? It is the polite way of signaling racial resentment politics. I saw a lot of people on the Twitter app, right, talk about, oh, well, this is about phrasing, and if you just use divest resources, blah, blah, blah. No, that's not what this is about, right? This is a placeholder for politicians who want to center white backlash. So much of the story of factional fighting, in my opinion, is driven by this question of race-class solidarity versus appeasing reactionary racist backlash. And I know you all are going to dive into all of this much deeper, but to me, this is the crux of the story, right? Whenever you make inroads and build a large coalition around the advancement of Black lives, brown lives, Indigenous lives, basically non-white lives, boom, here come those who want to undo all of that. And unfortunately, there are always folks on your side ready to throw you under the bus. I also really want to ground this conversation in the reality of what we're discussing and not just political abstraction for a moment, right? 8 minutes and 46 seconds. That was the time it took to murder George Floyd. Now, I didn't watch the video, nor do I ever need to see another Black person being brutalized or murdered by the police to understand that in this country and many others, Black lives are not held dear or matter, right? If we did, it wouldn't have to take what it takes to get police to stop murdering us with impunity. Taking a moment to really say their names and center what this conversation is about. It's about Sandra Bland, Philando Castile, Jamar Clark, Eric Garner, Mike Brown, Tamir Rice, Trayvon Martin, and Breonna Taylor, right? Unfortunately, there are so many more names and lives brutally ended prematurely. That is the status quo that a Miss Abigail Spanberger and Joe Manchin want to uphold without being made uncomfortable. Now, talking about racial justice writ large and what it means to have members of Congress who are ready to unapologetically hold the line and push the conversation forward in the halls of power, I feel like that's not new. I really want to honor the work and legacy of those who paved the way. We would not have an Ayanna Pressley, Cori Bush, or Ilhan Omar without Shirley Chisholm, right? We wouldn't have a Jamal Bowman without the giants of the civil rights movement like Elijah Cummings and John Lewis. But the reality is that this work is not ever going to advance in Congress or City Hall, right? It's Democratic mayors in cities without the sustained and continued pressure of the streets.
The thing that's frustrating about all that is that, whether it's Colin Kaepernick, whether it's the phrase Black Lives Matter, whether it's defund the police, all of it, like Amira is saying, is a symbol of some discomfort amongst especially white voters with racial justice. I mean, the other frustrating thing about it is basically between 2014 and 2016, everyone is like, what's the demand of Black Lives Matter? What are the demands? And, the Black Lives Matter organizers said, our demand is to stop killing us. And I think this year they were like, okay, the activists in the street were like, we do have a demand. Stop giving these people money to do this crazy shit. And they have succeeded in some parts. Many municipalities around the country have begun conversations or begun enacting policies to shift resources from over-aggressive policing, from police militarization, toward social services and public health. I have in front of me the 2012 Democratic Platform on public safety. And in the 2012 Democratic Platform, this is the first sentence. In the last 4 years, rates of serious crimes like murder, rape, and robbery have reached 50-year lows, but there is more work to do. We support efforts to ensure our courageous police officers and first responders are equipped with the best technology, equipment, and innovative strategies to prevent crimes and to prevent and fight crime. So in 2012, while police violence is still happening, the Democratic Party is saying, well, crime might be at a low, but there's still more crime to figure out how to do shit about. And then today, the Biden platform, or the 2020 Democratic Party platform, it's not super progressive. There's a lot of work to do. But in the 2020 Democratic platform, this is what it says: reorienting our public safety approach toward prevention and away from over-policing, in order to prevent law enforcement from being unnecessarily entangled in the everyday lives of Americans. The reason that is in there is because of everything that happened this year with protesters, some of whom were calling for defund the police. And so today, no Democrat is going to shit on Black Lives Matter, and no Democrat is going to shit on Colin Kaepernick. A few years from now, I can imagine no Democrat is going to say that reallocating resources away from over aggressive policing towards social services was a crazy idea. And so I feel for some of the activists who were calling for this because it must be frustrating. But, the job of many conservative Democrats feel their job is to shit on activists and shit on the left and shit on progressives.
Right. Could you have imagined in 2012, the entire Democratic leadership kneeling with kente cloth, like real solidarity moves there, right? That wouldn't have happened.
Wow.
I think one of the reasons activists are so frustrated is because, they took the streets in 2014 in Ferguson and New York and Chicago and places all around the country. And what they got was body cameras. And what they got was the Ferguson report. And life didn't get better this year in 2020. And I think people are just frustrated and they're like, okay, like, just like you guys fucking, when you say that teachers aren't doing their job and you take away money from public education, I don't know. I think like it's the saddest thing about it is that when there aren't millions of people in the streets, they just fold so quickly. It's scary because I don't think this is something that needs to be addressed at its root cause. And if there are major sections of the Democratic Party who are spending way more time criticizing activists than talking about how they plan to stop police violence, that's not a good sign.
Right? I mean, just today you had Cori Bush, talk about the fact that when she was wearing her Breonna Taylor mask and people thought her name was Breonna Taylor because they didn't know her name or what that means, right? That this woman was murdered by police in her house, in her bed, in the dead of the night, and we're still looking for justice. Like, they think we forgot because people are still out in the streets. Just because media has moved on does not mean we have moved on from the fact that we will have justice. And justice means dismantling systems that kill us. Like, that is the point. Anyways, defund my butt. I cannot.
I think that's such an important point, Amir, about how just because the media moves on doesn't mean the movement has moved on. And I think, we're not doing predictions for the Biden presidency on this pod, but if I were to offer one would be that I think now that there is a Democratic president in the White House, I think that movement politics is not going away. And I think given what we saw in the Obama era, a Democrat wins, there's some euphoria, then there's disappointment, and then there are movements. And I think that there's much more movement infrastructure at the beginning of the Biden presidency than there was at the beginning of the Obama presidency. So if I was just consulting for Democratic leadership, not even giving ideological advice, but just trying to help them prepare for the next year, I would say, look, AOC is trying to explain to you that, the squad didn't come up with that slogan. It comes from the movement in the same way that, LBJ and some of the pro-civil rights Democrats in Congress in the 60s might have not been comfortable with Black Power as a slogan, but it wasn't in their power whether or not that slogan got onto, the national discussion. The movement put it there. And then you as a politician need to respond to your constituents making that demand. And I don't think that is going to go away.
And okay, one last thing.
Yes.
Max Rose was attacked in his race for attending a Black Lives Matter rally, and they associated him attending a Black Lives Matter rally with defunding the police. So they're going to do that to everyone, regardless of what your actual position is. And this is why what they're doing with these attack ads are just trying to say the typical Republican Party stuff, that you are too friendly with Black people, that you're too friendly with racial justice, and that you're too friendly, with activists. And that is just what the playbook is on the other side. And so it had nothing to do with defund the police at the end of the day. They were upset that he was at a rally. And I don't know what Max Rose could have done differently, but it was not about him supporting defund the police. It was not about defund the police at all. It was about racial justice and where he was at the time. And he even said that in his concession speech.
Yes, yes. The GOP will lie about you because they are liars. Okay, I can't end this conversation without getting one thing off my chest, which is just how undemocratic American political institutions are and how I think that's making this factional conflict worse unnecessarily. But taking a step back, I think both the left and the establishment reacted to election night with some despair that despite the deaths of 200,000 Americans in a catastrophically managed pandemic, most voters are just immovable partisans. Like Team Red and Team Blue are so polarized that even mass death cannot break the intensity of people's partisan attachments. And I think part of what's happening there is that politics in American life is really more like sports or entertainment at this point. Like Team Red and Team Blue have their different celebrities, they have their own media. And part of what allows that to happen is that I don't think most Americans are actually making any connection between what's happening in politics and any concrete, lasting changes in their day-to-day experience. And this was a disconnect that AOC was talking about even before the election. She was talking to a reporter from Vanity Fair in her district. She pointed at a cab driver and a grocery store worker in her district and said, if his life doesn't feel different, if their life doesn't feel different, if these people's lives don't actually feel different, we're done. You know how many Trumps there are in waiting? And reflecting on it, it just reminded me that the intensity of partisan polarization is part of what allows another Trump in waiting to take power. Because now we know Team Red is just going to back Team Red's nominee, even if they do what President Trump has done. So if we're going to defeat those Trumps in a landslide, and if we're going to have any chance of breaking these dynamics of intense partisan attachment that just seem unresponsive to the realities of the crises that we face, we're going to need to govern in a way that changes people's lives and have voters understand that those changes were a result of that governance and of those policies. And I don't think that's like a new insight. That's how the New Deal succeeded, right? Like FDR facing Hoover in 1932 during a depression wins in a landslide, yes. But there's no guarantee that FDR is going to pull that off again in 1936. It's the policies of the New Deal passed in FDR's first term that win the hearts and minds of millions of Americans who then become reliable Democratic voters. That's what we would have wanted the next Democratic president to do, whether it was Bernie or Biden, with a Green New Deal. But then election night happens and we all say, oh, well, it's not a historic election like FDR in 1932 or the Reagan Revolution in 1980 because we can all see that Democrats are likely not going to take back the Senate. Okay. But there is where I think we start to let the undemocratic Senate and the gerrymandered House skew our interpretation of what's happening in American politics in a way that I think bleeds into this factional fight. But I'll get there. So there is actually a similarity between FDR in 1932, Reagan in 1980, and Biden in 2020. Only 4 times in the past 100 years has a presidential candidate unseated an incumbent president who was seeking a second term. FDR unseated Hoover, Reagan unseated Carter, Clinton unseated Bush Sr., and now Biden has unseated Trump. And Biden has done it with the highest percentage of the popular vote for a challenger to an incumbent since FDR in 1932, topping Reagan's popular vote percentage in 1980. But no one is talking about Biden having a presidency like FDR or Reagan because he's not going to have the majorities in the House and Senate. But that's not because Democrats are failing to win majorities of voters. The Senate, as we know, is irredeemably undemocratic. Democratic senators consistently represent around 20 million more Americans than their GOP counterparts. And look, like maybe some people will say, look, it's just pie in the sky to talk about reforming the Senate. But I think we have to talk about it. Just to give one example, the 3 Supreme Court justices nominated by Trump a president who lost the popular vote, by the way, those 3 justices were also confirmed by a bloc of senators who represent less than half the country. And the House is not great either. House Democrats have won a majority of the vote in 2012, in 2016, in 2018, and in 2020. But in 2012, when Democratic candidates won a million more votes than Republicans, the GOP still ended up with 57% of the seats in the House. In 2016, again, Republicans received fewer votes than Democrats, but still had a majority in Congress. Then, in 2018, there's a D+8 blue wave. Democrats finally win back the House. This year, so far, the national vote for the House of Representatives is looking like it's D+2, and some of the Democrats who won swing seats in that blue wave have now lost. Which gets me back to this elephant in the room of the factional fight. And I think the elephant in the room is that, yes, I think Democrats of all ideologies need to do the hard work of running good campaigns, as we've talked about. But at a certain point, I would like someone to say, hey, we win a majority almost all the time. We shouldn't have to also then be winning in Alabama Senate race and winning this many gerrymandered House seats and producing a D+8 blue wave every election just to get a chance to govern for the majority that we win almost every time. Like, there is something structurally wrong here. And I understand that it's a very difficult problem to solve, but I think when Democrats like Abigail Spanberger react to election night by blaming the left, it's not just that it ignores everything we've just discussed, but I think it also helps the GOP frame themselves and frame their victory as legitimately representing the will of the American people in a divided government, reinforcing this idea that, America is really more conservative than you thought. And I think that's really dangerous, not just because it's not true, but because I think the GOP knows what they're doing. I think Mitch McConnell knows that he relies on undemocratic institutions, the Senate, the Electoral College, and the courts to rule this country, despite consistently only getting a minority of the votes. And I think that structural advantage that Republicans have is not going to go away because the trends around urban, rural, liberal, conservative divides are just widening. So at some point, the Democratic Party is going to have to confront minority rule. I don't know. What do you think?
Take us to church, Waleed. This is his bread and butter. Let's go.
All right, let's do this. So, in any other country in the world, if you won the national election by 5 million, 6 million, I don't even know what it is now, 7 million votes, and you defeated an incumbent president, you'd be able to pass a lot of laws. In New Zealand, they had one mass shooting, and then they passed a huge suite of anti-gun violence laws to make it more difficult to possess certain types of firearms and to increase the public safety. I am really frustrated that people in the media, our elected officials, our organizations normalize that this is a normal process where Mitch McConnell and the Republican Party get to have some say as a co-governing partner in the Democratic administration when the Democratic administration has defeated the party of Mitch McConnell by millions of votes. Meanwhile, there's all these talking heads on TV being like, oh, well, it's going to be great that Mitch McConnell has the Senate and Joe Biden has the presidency because they are going to represent the middle of the country and get things done. And I'm like, have you seen Mitch McConnell's party this week on TV? Have you seen Mitch McConnell this week on TV? He is trying to legitimize a coup run by Donald Trump and therefore delegitimize Joe Biden's victory and therefore delegitimize Joe Biden's next 4 years as the president. And then you have defund my butt Joe Manchin going on TV being like, I am ready to work with Mitch McConnell. And I'm like, have you seen the Across the Aisle? Across the Aisle is a snake pit. It's a place you don't want to go, Joe Manchin. Meanwhile, you have this QAnon lady. I'm going off on a tangent today. But anyone see the QAnon lady's tweet?
Marjorie about the masks?
I don't even know her name, but she was like, I'm sure she's going to listen to this podcast and say, I have a name, excuse me. But Marjorie, this is the Republican Party, folks. Marjorie is like, I stood up in front of the entire freshman class and said, masks are oppressive. Hashtag my body, my choice. I don't know, folks. It doesn't seem like the Republican Party is a good faith, normal political party. Maybe we should stop taking them seriously. But anyway, to get serious for a second, the thing that I'm most worried about, and the thing that we're going to see happen over the next year, next 2 years, is how hard are Democrats willing to fight for the majority that elected them, and how hard are Republicans willing to fight to enshrine minority rule in this House through gerrymandering, because they have the control of many states, through the Senate because of the rural bias of the Senate, and in the Supreme Court, where they now have a 6-3 majority, conservative majority on the Supreme Court. And I don't see that Democrats have a real message or a plan to talk about this elephant in the room where, Democrats in the Senate represent 20 million more people. If they win Georgia, 40 million more people than Republicans. I have this bet with Amira where, I think 10 or 20 years from now, either we have Senate reforms or we have increasing amounts of bad stuff happening in our country. And I'm worried about it. And so I don't know what to do about it. I mean, there are several reforms to make happen, but this basic concept that the Republican Party is increasingly the party of minority rule, and they keep losing elections but keep preserving power, seems like something Democrats are going to have to talk about and stop pretending that it's normal. This is one of the things, going back to the first conversation, where it's like, why did Democrats lose down ballot? Several reasons, one of which is that Democrats can win nationally by 8 million votes, 7 million votes, 6 million votes, whatever, and still lose the House and Senate because of how the system is set up. And I don't think it's going to get better over time. I think all the stats say that the Electoral College and the Senate will become increasingly white and increasingly represent white voters over people of color. And in the House, with gerrymandering, they are really going to do this is their last gasp. They understand their policy platform, their ideology is not popular. And so what are they going to do? They're not going to change their positions. They're going to try to preserve minority rule as much as possible. The last thing I'll say about this is that Mitch McConnell wants Chuck Schumer and Joe Biden to do anything that will make it harder for them to get reelected. So what could we see? We could see a stimulus package where Mitch McConnell asks for raising the Social Security age. We could see a stimulus package where Mitch McConnell asks, I will give you a stimulus package, but a year from now, you are going to have to cut Medicaid, Medicare, and Social Security. We could see an immigration reform package where they provide a pathway to citizenship for 11 million undocumented immigrants if they fully fund the wall. We could see a climate package where they start moving toward clean energy, but also allow more fracking pipelines to be built. This doesn't make sense, folks. This doesn't make sense. The voters did not elect these new. The voters in this election did not say, "Hey, we want the Democrats to move to 100% clean energy, and we want Mitch McConnell to build more pipelines." That is not what the message they sent. So I don't know. I'm frustrated.
I don't mean to laugh. It's just like I was like, yes, take us to church. This is. Election week. Waleed was like, Amira, you're thinking about the box. You're inside the box, when in reality, the box is the fucking problem. And you need to get with it. Everything, these institutions, they are fundamentally enshrining our disenfranchisement. And that's the battle. And I was like, homie, I can't think about these fundamental issues right now. Like, we got shit to crank out. So I can't think about big picture, but I hear you. I'm with you. This is very, very important stuff. But also, these institutions, I feel like we're all this conversation is going to circle back to what? Racism. Because why? That's what these institutions are enshrining, right? Anyways, I'm going to stop there, but it's very frustrating.
Yeah, and there's a fascinating aspect to this, which is that this hasn't necessarily become a factional divide in the Democratic Party, although it is becoming one, I think, because you have Democratic senior leadership. For example, Dianne Feinstein being very polite and very kind and to Amy Coney Barrett before the election and legitimizing what should essentially be seen as a stolen Supreme Court seat. Versus, I think, members of the squad who are much more willing to call out the anti-democratic moves of the GOP. But it's not just members of the squad. I think you have many liberal pundits who are not necessarily aligned with the left who are calling out minority rule. So to me, it shouldn't necessarily be a factional divide, because it's not a factional divide. It's a partisan divide. It's the GOP as much as possible, through as many institutions as possible, particularly the Senate, the courts, and the Electoral College, trying to entrench minority rule and keep the Democrats out of power. So you would expect, in terms of the partisan incentives for the Democratic Party, that they would say, all right, we got to fight this. And, the GOP is out there legitimizing these wild claims of voter fraud. They are not a legitimate governing partner in a democracy. But I don't see a unity from the Democrats that I would like to see, or that I even might expect. So I think it's just going to be fascinating to see whether, the left is always accused of not caring about the Democratic Party as a party, not caring about Team Blue. But I think it will be fascinating to see if the left ends up taking the lead on this fight between a multiracial democracy that translates a majority of votes to a majority of seats versus a party that is accepting minority rule and is accepting an increasingly anti-democratic and racist governing partner. All right, first episode of Group Chat in the bag. If you're listening to this, thanks for joining us for episode 1 of Bloc Party. We'll be back next week with another episode. If you want to roll up to the party with a question, idea, comment, tirade, confession, you can email blockpartypod@gmail.com. My name's Guido. Becca Rose is our producer. Leslie Gaston Bird is our mix engineer. Special thank you to Amy Westervelt, Michael Catano, as well as Sam Eilertson and Nate Birnbaum of the Generation Green New Deal podcast, who each provided invaluable support and counsel. See you on the block.